Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, February 4th, 2010. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, this week, Chris Colby, editor of Brew Your Own magazine, talks to us about malt conditioning. He walks us through a couple of methods that we can try at home. Also, Chris helps me answer letters from the mailbag. If you're new to home brewing or would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. And you can follow me on Twitter at Basic Brewing. All one word. Also, you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/basicbrewing.james. And you can find our show page on facebook.com/basicbrewing. Thanks to everybody clicking on the Amazon.com associate link on our basicbrewing.com site. Whenever you think of Amazon, think of us and click on our associate link first. It won't cost you any extra, and you'll be helping us to bring you the show, and we appreciate your support. We also have associate links for Brew Your Own magazine and the American Homebrewers Association on our site, too. We're continuing our expansion into the international arena. A couple of weeks ago, I told you about easyhomebrew.co.uk, which is selling our DVDs in the UK. Now we've landed in Norway. Tom Young in Norway is starting up an online homebrew shop this year. It's not fully functional yet, but among the first products he's featuring are our DVDs. The site is brygg.no. That's brygg.no, and I asked Tom to help me with the pronunciation.
Brygg.no.
So that's brygg.no. I hope that's close. brygg.no. Thanks, Tom. Now listeners on the other side of the ocean have two closer places to order our stuff. easyhomebrew.co.uk and brygg.no. Chris Rockwell, VP of the Maltos Falcons, asked if I would plug their competition in April. It's the 2010 Mayfair Homebrew Competition. It's AHA and BJCP sanctioned, and the entry deadline is March 24th through April 10th, so you've got time to start your brew. You can find more details and pre-register at maltosfalcons.com. Also get a note from Luke Mullins, who's president of the Homebrewers Association of Middle Mississippi. Luke has a suggestion after hearing last week's show on building a club website. Luke says, I've run across a free service that our club is beta testing before we adios our club forum. He says the service is called Ning. That's N-I-N-G. It allows you to create a Ning network that closely resembles MySpace and Facebook. It has features like events, photo/video galleries, forums, and a chat room. Admins can easily make a documents area to post meeting minutes, bylaws, etc. Luke says from an admin's perspective, it's very easy to manage, but it can be limiting on modifications. There are also apps that you can install very easily to enhance your network. You can spend some cash and upgrade your Ning network with their premium services. As Luke said, they're still testing the service, but if you're interested in looking at Ning for your club site, check out ning.com, Ning.com. Eric down in Athens, Georgia, has a cautionary tale for us. Eric says, Hey, James, I have a PSA for your listeners. Do not try to heat pasteurized cider in the bottles. Eric says, I picked up on this idea in an attempt to achieve a sweet, carbonated cider. You'd mentioned in an episode of yours that it sounded like a bad idea, and I can confirm that it is. I don't truly understand the term, or I didn't truly understand the term bottle bomb, Eric says, until this event. I put the bottles in my brew pot filled with water to the top of the bottles and then slowly began to bring to 170 degrees Fahrenheit. At around 155 degrees Fahrenheit, the first one exploded. Fortunately, I had a lid on the pot, Eric says, but even so, shards of glass, or shads, whichever, of glass, managed to burst their way out and fly over my kitchen. A series of others proceeded to explode overnight. I left them alone until they cooled off. The damage the exploded bombs wrought was incredible. If I had been near one, it would have surely sent me to the hospital. So, no on the heat pasteurization. Wow. Glad you're okay, Eric. Thanks for sharing the story so we won't try it ourselves. Heat pasteurization on capped cider bottles. Bad idea. Okay, let's move on to our chat with Chris Colby on malt conditioning, because we'll start out with even more letters from you guys out there. Well, Chris Colby, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me on the show.
We are going to talk about conditioned milling, conditioning your malt before you mill it to get better results, hopefully. But before we talk about that, I thought since I got you on the phone, I was answering an email this morning, and a couple of these could, have more than one answer. So rather than me stick a stake in the ground, I thought I'd put you on the spot.
Let me do it.
Yeah, darn right. So I have 4 questions, actually. I thought I had 3, but I've got 4. Are you ready?
Yes.
You're in the soundproof booth with your headphones on. Matt from Los Angeles, California. By the way, before we do that, let's talk about the experiment. Mm-hmm. The deadline for entries was this week, and we got a good representation.
Yeah, we got quite a few entries, and
we've got 1 or 2 more coming. I've gotten an email or 2 from brewers who say, I missed the deadline, but I'm still, can I still play? And I say, yeah. I mean, we're working on. I've sent my beers up to Brad Sturgeon to be analyzed, and you're working on yours. And so we've still got some time. So if you're still got your data that you want to report to us, go ahead and use that experiment form at basicbrewing.com/experiment, and we'll be glad to have you on board. And again, I was impressed with the amount of detail that the brewers gave us when they did their reporting.
Yeah, that's critical, to know exactly what people did, because otherwise, it's uninterpretable, and you have to, go back and contact them and and ask questions. So yeah, it's great having all that detail on the entry forms.
And I don't want to give anything away right now, but should be some interesting results. And at least one of them kind of went a different direction from what I was thinking. So it's always interesting. Okay, now to the questions. Matt in Los Angeles, California, says that he's planning to brew an extract Pliny clone, that's Pliny the Elder from Russian River, with specialty grains, and the recipe calls for a long 2-month secondary. And Matt says, I don't want to wait that long. 2 questions about secondary fermentation. He says, if your beer is going to be in the secondary for, say, a month, should the dry hops be added during the last week to accentuate the hop aromas and flavors that are extracted, or will dry hopping during the entire duration of secondary fermentation extract even more flavors and aromas? And 2, as an adjunct, he says, get it, to the first question, are prolonged secondary fermentations greater than 1 week really that beneficial to beer development, especially regarding American ale style? So first of all, are long secondary fermentations or long stays in the secondary fermenter necessary or beneficial to a beer like this Pliny clone? And 2, if he's going to dry hop during a long stay in the secondary, when should he? The whole time or just the last, say, week?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to it, I would also add, if you're going to attempt to do a Pliny the Elder clone, I would highly recommend doing a full wort boil, even if you're doing an extract beer, just because you'll be adding so much hops to there that if you're boiling a condensed amount of wort, it's gonna soak up a ton of the hops, and or rather the hops are going to soak up a ton of the wort, and you're going to be left with a lot less beer than you wanted, and also probably less bitterness, which is of course one of the questions that our experiment just addressed. But anyway, of the questions you actually had that I'm just not butting in on. uh, where whether a long secondary is valuable, and if so, when to dry hop. On the first question, whether or not a long secondary is worthwhile, I tend to think that it got to be a fad in homebrewing for a while, sort of to age beers a long time. This idea arose that the longer your conditioning time, like the better, and I don't think that's always the case. I certainly think a lot of, certainly any average strength ale you want to brew, have it mature quickly and be drinking it while it's fresh. And Pliny's a little bit bigger than an average strength ale, but it's not, just Titanic that way. I also think a lot of people, early experiences with homebrewing are that beers improve with age, but I also think a lot of that is due to people under pitching and having, when the beer is young, the yeast have struggled a lot, and the beer is really not all that good, and it, a little bit of time does help it out. But I've found that if you pitch an adequate amount of yeast and really take care of your fermentation, even big beers should come into, should become drinkable fairly quickly. And, with ales, what was the conditioning time? It was 2 months.
Yeah.
That's way too long.
Yeah, he said the recipe recommended 2 months.
That's way too long. Yeah. One thing you could probably check with Russian River and see how long they age it. I would very much doubt they age it 2 months. No brewer's going to fill their tanks with, have it just sit there for 2 months, taking up, tank space that it could be using. I would say 2 months is really excessive. If you run a good fermentation, I would say a couple weeks is probably more like it. Although that's a very aggressively hopped beer, and it'll certainly start to mellow a little bit beyond the 2 weeks with regard to the hop bitterness and the aggressive hop edge to it.
And say if you were gonna age it or keep it in the secondary for 2 weeks, would you dry hop it for the entire 2 weeks or just the last half of that?
Right, I would dry hop it for the last little bit before you packaged it. It takes a little while for dry hops to kind of express themselves. If you've ever kegged a beer and added dry hops, at the same time that it was carbonating, you notice the first couple days, not a lot of character, but then, 3 or 4 days into it, it gets better. And if you leave it there for a while, you eventually start extracting some, or you can start extracting some sort of grassy notes. And if you're dry hopping in secondary, where it's the beer's at sort of ale fermentation temperature, it depends on the beer. Different beers have different levels of alcohol, different pHs, and so forth. But usually a week is pretty good. That'll give you almost all the hop aroma that you would get from, if you extended it, but then you're not running into the potential problem of extracting, sort of grassy notes from all the plant material.
And you can dry hop in the primary fermenter. I mean, there's no need to rack, really.
You can, once fermentation slows down. Yeah, you could dunk a bag of hops in there too.
Question number 2, or email number 2. Evan is asking, I almost always keg my homebrew. Right now I have 3 different beers on tap in my kegerator, but I have a 4th in a corny already. I needed the carboy that it was in. Apparently he doesn't have room in his kegerator for another keg. So he says, would you, A, force carbonate the keg and leave it at room temperature, B, force carbonate and leave on the screened-in porch, which is at a constant 40 degrees in the winter, C, leave uncarbonated at room temperature, or D, leave uncarbonated on the screened-in porch at 40 degrees. So we have 2 variables there. There's room temperature or 40 degrees out on the porch, and there's carbonated and uncarbonated in the keg. Which pick 2?
I'd go with cold and carbonated. There's I mean, with respect to carbonation, there's no advantage to leaving it uncarbonated. You're just going to have to do it later anyway, and you might as well let the the bubbles soak in and get more fine more fine bubbles in the foam or whatever by letting it carbonate and sit for a while. And then if you're going to let beer sit, storing it cold is always better than storing it warm. So yeah, that one's very straightforward. Yeah, carbonate the beer, keep it cold, and it should be fantastic when you kick a keg out of the kegerator.
Yeah, and one added advantage is it's already going to be at or near serving temperature. So
right, yeah, it'll be ready. It'll be conditioned. The CO2 will be worked in. Yeah, you'll be gold.
Brian from Lincoln, Nebraska says, I'm on my 4th batch at the moment, and I want to brew up a wheat beer. Nothing fancy, but I also want to add some lemon to it to make it a nice summer beer, if it lasts that long, he says. My question is, how should I go about adding the lemon? Should I only add the rind to the boil, or do I add whole lemons to the secondary fermenter? Yeah, well,
it depends on what you want. I mean, first of all, you'd never add the rind to the beer. You'd add the zest. I'm assuming he knows that, but just to use the right terminology. And those are going to give you different characters. If you zest the lemon and add it in the last couple minutes of the boil, they'll give you a character that's similar to in a lot of wit beers. They'll be orange zest in it, or you can find Belgian beers these days with lemon zest in them if you look around, and that's a specific flavor. But if you use if you squeeze the lemons into the secondary, that's a whole different flavor. That's the lemonade kind of flavor, and so that's really a question of how do you want the beer to taste? Do you want it to have that slight sort of lemon zesty spice, like it's a kind of sort of like a saison or a beer de garde or wit beer in that frame, or do you want it to be like a beer with almost a Mike's Hard Lemonade cast to it?
Yeah,
and then in that case, add some lemon juice to secondary.
And you can always add lemon at time of serving as well. If you want to just add a squeeze of lemon juice, that way you could control it, and that way you could also, if people don't like fruit with their beer for some reason, then they could go without it as well and just have a straight wheat beer.
Right.
And then the one that we had to look up, both of us had to look up, is a bit tricky. Chad, I'm not sure where Chad's from, says, I had a friend of mine give me a 50-pound sack of crimped barley. I'm in the process of trying to malt some now. I've looked online trying to see if there's anything I need to do other than the regular process to malt crimped barley. So here's my question. Do you know of anyone who has malted this barley? If it can't be malted, can you just crack it and use a lot of it to brew with? So any other advice you can or help you can pass on to me about the 2-row crimped barley would be appreciated. So neither one of us knew what crimped barley was. We had to look it up.
I sure did. Yeah, crimped barley, as we found out through the miracle of Google, it's barley that is harvested early with the idea that it's going to be fed to animals. It's harvested early with a fairly high level of moisture in it. It's then treated with some kind of fungicide that they didn't, the website didn't explain, and then stored, up until the time that it's fed to animals. And so having read that, I would say, the odds this is going to be something worthwhile for brewing are fairly low. I mean, first of all, until you know like what the barley has been treated with, I wouldn't, for health reasons, use it in brewing. I mean, presumably, if it's being treated to be fed with animals, it's not some deadly poison, because the animals that are being fed to are mammals too. But still, the differences in health standards for livestock versus people are somewhat different. And secondly, I mean, when it comes to any sort of unmalted barley that you buy in a feed store, you've got to think about a couple things. One is that there are a lot of different varieties of barley grown out there. There are barleys that are grown specifically for feed, and in those, they're relatively high nitrogen varieties of barley. They're given nitrogen in the field, fertilized in the field late in the season, so that the barley has a nice high protein level for the for the animals that it's going to feed. On the other hand, there are varieties of barley grown for malting, and these are low protein varieties, and they're specifically not fertilized after, like, I believe it's the 3-leaf stage, but very, very early on in growth, they quit adding nitrogen to the fields, and these, are grown and harvested with the idea that they're going to be malting barleys. And if you just buy grain at the feed store, you're not likely to know what variety of barley it is. It's possible that you'll get a malting variety, because stuff that farmers can't sell to maltsters, they'll sell as feed, but you have no idea if it's a real malting variety. And so, yeah, you're just, unless you know the variety of barley and what the protein content is, your odds of making a real successful batch of beer are not that good. I mean, the differences between the percent of nitrogen in these different barleys isn't huge, and if you malt it on a small scale, it wouldn't be that the beer was just absolutely awful. I would guess. I haven't done it, but it would seem to me, if you're going to go through all the hassle of malting, make the little bit of effort to find an appropriate barley. And as for there's the other question in there, can you just crack it and use it? No. You can't use unmalted barley except as an adjunct. You could use a small amount, 10%, maybe 20%, if you did a cereal mash along with some malted barley. But you can't just go buy seed barley and crack it as if it was malt, because it's for one thing, it hasn't been killed, so it doesn't have any of the malt flavor on the outside, and on the second hand, it hasn't been malted, so there's no the enzymes really aren't developed to the point that it would need to convert all the starches. And if you try to crush it, you can take malted barley and chew on it, and it's crunchy or whatever. But if you take a kernel of just seed barley and try to chew it, you'll break your teeth. It's hard as a rock. And so you're likely also to, if you try to mill too much of it, you might damage your mill. So you can't crack and use seed barley for 100% of your grain bill. You can use it as an adjunct, and some Belgian brewers do, but it's not. Malted barley has gone through the process of malting, whereas seed barley has not.
Plus, this website, the Kelvin Cave Limited website, they say grains are harvested up to 4 weeks earlier than normal at moisture contents of 30 to 45%. They're then processed through a crimping machine, which crushes them to expose the carbohydrate and or protein, and a special preservative is applied. So it sounds like they sort of at least halfway mill the barley before they add the preservatives. So, I mean, seeds that are broken up are not going to grow anyway. They're not going to sprout. You're not going to be able to malt them.
Yeah, you couldn't malt that. I would not think. That doesn't sound promising.
So, get yourself a cow is our advice. If you've got a 50-pound bag of crimped barley, get yourself a cow, and or find a farmer that has a cow. But I wouldn't. We wouldn't put that in our beer, would we, Chris?
I wouldn't put it in my beer.
Well,
one of the few things I wouldn't put in my beer.
See, just Reinheitsgebot is a 4-letter word, but still, there are things that I would not put in my beer. Let's go on to things that we will put in our beer, and that is, let's talk about conditioned milling or conditioning your malt before you put it through the milling process. So what are we talking about here, conditioning our malt?
Well, the way that most homebrewers mill their grains is they take the sack or whatever and pour it in their hopper and just grind it dry. And a lot of brew pubs do the same thing. Even regionals. But there was an idea, and I'm not sure when it peaked. It was a little while in the past, not way historical past, but in the not too distant past, where in Europe it was sort of fashionable. They practiced something called wet milling, which was they would steep the grains in a hopper above the mash tun for long enough for the inside of the grain to pick up a good deal of moisture, like it was around 30%, and then they would mill the grains quickly through a 2-row mill with a very narrow gap. And what would happen would be basically the pressure from the roller mill would just squeeze out the center of the barley kernel because it was wet, and leave the husk basically 100% intact. So it would be you'd end up with almost whole barley husks, and then the slurry of yeast paste, and that would all dump into the mash tun where it would be hydrated up to the point where that you could mash it.
Well, it wouldn't be yeast paste.
No, starch paste. I'm sorry.
Now, but why is that important?
Well, in commercial breweries, it did a couple things. One is that it greatly lowered the probability of a grain dust explosion, which, as a home brewer, that's not ever going to be a worry for us. But as commercial, when you're milling lots and lots and lots of grain, that was. But it also did a couple things with regard to beer. One of them was it made for easier lautering. When you have the grain pieces almost completely intact, it made for a sort of a larger, fluffier grain bed, and brewers could lauter faster. They could run off. And given the tight sort of mill gap, in conjunction with that, if they didn't run off, if they ran off just slowly enough, they could also actually increase their extract a little bit. And a further benefit was, given that the husks were sort of damaged less in the grinding process, fewer tannins would be extracted, especially if you sparged quite a bit.
Yeah, when Kai Troyster was on the show at one point, we talked about his process of conditioning malt, and his was pretty simple. He just took like a spray bottle, I believe, and just kind of spritzed his grain and sort of got it a bit wet before he put it through the grain mill. You've got some techniques that we can use at home that are a little more high-tech, I guess, than that. You want to talk about those?
Sure. The ideas I presented in the article are sort of outgrowths of wet milling. Because in commercial brewing, what they found was that although wet milling worked well with regards to increasing lautering efficiency, it tended to support microbial growth up in the up in the hoppers above the mash tun, and it was hard for them to keep that clean and going. So they looked for another way of doing it, to have sort of the same benefits, but without the drawback. And what different brewers hit on was either a quick steep in hot water or steam conditioning, with the idea in both cases that you'd basically get just the husks wet, and then you'd mill the grain, and with just enough moisture in the husks, they would hold together, to a decent extent, maybe not quite to the extent that they would in wet milling, but they'd hold together well. And then again, you'd be milling with a little bit tighter gap than you would compared to milling dry grains, and you'd get fairly good lautering efficiency because you'd have whole intact or close to whole intact husk pieces. You'd have the middle of the grain crushed fairly finely, and you'd be able to lauter nicely, but without the long, sort of steep in the hopper above the mash tun. You'd lower the chances of getting a contamination, in your vessel that would then be hard to reach and clean and all that.
And I guess you'd also lower the chance that you'd start any conversion process, before the grain was even milled.
Sure. In classical sort of wet milling, if you want to call it that, the grains were soaked in hot water, and you would start, the mashing would start before the grain has actually been cracked, and this way, it went in either steaming or treating with hot water. The liquid really doesn't get there. There's really not much penetration into the center of the barley kernel before you crack it. So, there's not that problem.
So how do we do this at home?
Well, I came up with 2 ways. Both are really easy, and just sort of depends on how you're set up. How your home brewery is set up to do it. The easiest way I found is if you have a lauter tun that's just like a stainless steel vessel, or I guess it could be aluminum, but the typical sort of brewing vessel with a false bottom. Just add water to the vessel to a point where it's a couple inches below, or an inch below maybe the false bottom, enough so you can boil it, but the liquid isn't boiling up through the false bottom. Bring that little bit of water to a boil. Put your lid on that until the vessel fills up with steam, and then just put your unmilled malt in a steeping bag and stick it in that vessel for between 1 and 2 minutes, and you can open up the thing halfway through and stir the grain if you want to, but it doesn't really matter that much. I mean, worst case scenario, if the steam doesn't penetrate all the way to the middle of the grain bag, then you just have, some percentage of your grain is still dry, like it would have been anyway. So treat it with steam for 1 to 2 minutes, pull it out. I just dumped mine in a bucket and stirred it, and then a minute later started crushing it. And that's all you do. It's just really simple. And that simple steam treatment for a minute or two produces a very, very noticeable change in the size of your husk particles. Whereas if you mill, with a fairly tight gap, you're used to seeing the husk broken into 4 pieces or maybe more, in a lot of flour or whatever. The same way with steam conditioned malt, you see the same kind of level of flour and how much the interior of the kernel has been broken up, but you see the husks are much, much bigger. They're broken into fewer pieces, and there's a lot more sort of almost whole looking husk pieces.
And the false bottom is important because you wouldn't want to set your grain bag into a vat of boiling water.
Right. Yeah. The liquid itself, the boiling liquid, doesn't contact the grains. It just provides steam that comes up through the false bottom and then goes up through the malt.
I've also heard of home brewers. I think Rick Hagerbommer was from Big Foamy Head was one of them, who actually bought a home steamer machine and was going to try to use that in his mash tun to raise the temperature of his mash without adding heat to the bottom of the mash tun. I'm not sure how that worked out, but I guess theoretically, if you have a home steamer machine, you could introduce steam in that way too.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
An idea that resounds with with approval. But if you don't have a mash tun with a false bottom, you can use hot water as well.
Right. If you have a mash tun and you can't heat it, it's not the like the stainless steel vessel. If it's say just the picnic cooler with the the copper slots or whatever, you can put your malt in a steeping bag as before, and just pour hot water over it, sprinkle hot water over it for like less than a minute. Right around 45 to 50 seconds. I would put it in something like a watering can that you'd have for gardening. Heat the water, put it in there, and just sprinkle it over. And as you do, if you had a partner, this would be really helpful. Just have them stir while you do it. Do that for like 45 seconds. Stir the malt and let it rest for maybe a minute after that, and then proceed straight to milling. In the commercial side, when they do the hot water as opposed to the steam, they get more moisture into the husks. In the steam version, they shoot for I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's around like 2.5% to 3% moisture in the husks, or somewhere in that vicinity, or 2.5% and 3% more moisture, I guess I should say, than there is. Whereas in the water version, they aim for about 22%. So there's significantly more moisture in the when it's sprinkled with hot water than with steam. But in both cases, the idea is just to treat the outside of the grain, not to have it sink into the interior.
Now, how hot is this water?
About 170
Fahrenheit, which is
77 C.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Right around there.
I'm going to have to start using flashcards or something to help me remember what the metric equivalents are. After my last after the most recent basic brewing video where I screwed up completely and had to resort to on-screen graphics to correct what I was saying. So that sounds easy. I mean, it just sounds like another, kind of half a step to put in the brew day to hopefully improve your efficiencies and help guard against stuck sparges. So did you play with the gap on your mill?
Yeah, I closed it down from where I usually did when I did the test milling, because that's basically the idea. You want to condition your malt and then be able to crush finer than they're used to with compared to dry malt, but get with the husks being pliable, you get a finer crush on the interior, but the husks stay more intact. So
did you see, when you were playing with this in your home brewery, did you see less of the cloud of flour as you were pouring the grain into the mash tun?
Not really. If anything, it makes it a little more floury because it does crush the interior better. I didn't really. I couldn't say that I really looked for or noticed anything astoundingly huge in that. But the crush did seem a little bit more floury, and the husks definitely seemed to be much more, more pieces, larger pieces. That was a very definite outcome from the steaming.
So as you're playing with this, at least at first, it would seem to me that you should err on the side of being too dry rather than too wet, right? Because if you wet your grain too much before it goes into the malt mill, you're just asking for a big mess.
Yeah, if you let's say you did the water version and you poured, for some reason for 3 or 4 minutes instead of, 50 seconds. And then let's say you stirred it and let it sit for, say 15 minutes before you started. Then that would, the water would start to seep into the husk, into the interior kernel. And when you milled it, you would, there would be a point at which suddenly you'd be getting like sticky, barley flour on your mill, and you don't want that. So the idea with both of these would be, a very quick treatment with water, then just, stir it to even it out and get to milling right away. And remember that given that the standard practice is to dry mill, like if you don't get enough water in here, into the husks or whatever, it's not the end of the world. You've just milled your grain dry like you would have anyway.
Yeah.
So I would, if you were going to do this, and I mean, I don't view this as something that, I wouldn't say like every all grain brewer should do this without fail. It's not that kind of technique. I would say if you're interested in maybe making your lautering a little bit easier, if you sparge a lot on your beers and try to collect a lot of volume, and maybe you're looking to decrease your tannins, if you're just looking to crush a little bit finer, to increase your efficiency, and you're willing to put in, a couple extra minutes of work on the front end, then yeah, go ahead and try this. But it's not, dry milling can and has worked spectacularly for, both home brewers and, brew pub brewers and, a lot of regional brewers. So it's not something that, I wouldn't say that, everyone's going to be doing this in the future and you have to do this for beer quality. I would say that, this is a nice technique that, depending on how you mash and you lauter and what you're looking for, it might be something interesting to explore.
Excellent.
Was that your question? I think I just went off on a complete tangent.
That's okay. It's another tool in the toolbox.
Yeah. I've become a politician. I don't listen to the question anymore. I just say what point I wanted to make.
You're just working off your talking points.
Yep.
Well, at least everybody who listens to this podcast can agree that good beer is a good talking point.
Sure.
Well, all right, Chris. We will get to, maybe the next time we get together, we'll be tasting our experiment beers.
Yeah, that'll be good.
All right. Well, we'll talk to you then.
Okie doke.
Well, thanks again to Chris Colby. You can read his article on malt conditioning in the upcoming issue of Brew Your Own magazine. If you click on the BYO link on our site, you can get a free issue of the publication. And if you decide to subscribe after that, you'll be helping to support this show. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Our 2010 Brewers Logbooks still moving out the door. We've also got our Reinheitsgebot is a 4-letter word shirts on our shop as well. Those are also popular. Thanks to everybody for your support. You can check out our homebrewing DVDs, Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, Stepping into All Grain, Low-Tech Lagering and Decoction Mashing, and Introduction to Wine Kits. We've got combo deals on our side to save you a few bucks if you want to buy more than one DVD at a time. And you can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. Thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Cookie Swap, creative treats to share throughout the year, and The Bread Baker's Apprentice, mastering the art of extraordinary bread. Can you tell it's about lunchtime? Thanks again, everybody. Remember, I can't tell who bought what, so no worries there. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We appreciate your support. And that's it. That's all. Till next week. Thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio, and our website is provided by Kelly Dodson down in Austin, Texas. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.